Thank you, sir. And thanks, Lina. You actually set the stage for me. Uh, Before I start, a standard disclaimer, the opinions that are expressed in this talk are primarily mine and need not to be correlated with my government as well as my organization in particular. This is a pure academic research and based on open sources, although you may find it a bit Machiavellian, but nevertheless, that's bit attribution to me. Last couple of decades, you have seen a colossal change in the way in which cyber has become an important or integral component, especially in the military world. To an extent, most of the things that are happening in terms of cyber espionage, tactical cyber attacks, I would refer to, but they are typically being referred to an extent that it's a revolution in military affairs. Now, whenever this important aspect of has also raised the existential question that whether this tactical force multiplier or a force enabler is actually the strategic enabler to achieve strategic ends, or something somewhere is missing, or it's just something that's been created out in order to support certain military theorists and so on. The important aspect in order to understand this is on revolution in military affairs. Now, whenever there was a revolution in military affairs, it was always followed with a strategic effect. Whether it would be Air Force, whether it would be nuclear weapons, everywhere, whenever there was a revolution in military affairs, it was followed with a strategic effect. Now, in case the current tactical, or what we call as cyber espionage, limited cyber attacks, if they are really a revolution in military affairs, where is the strategic effect? And that's the important question, because that gives away the fact that something somewhere is missing. Hence, the primary aim of this talk would be to redefine what exactly would be a strategic cyber warfare, how exactly cyber warfare alone can be used as a means to get strategic ends done, primarily by inducing what is called a strategic paralytic effect onto the victim nation, rather than being a force multiplier to a conventional kinetic warfare being the primary warfare of an attack. That's going to be the whole proposition. In order to understand this aspect, we need to, I usually theorize both the two great theorists, the Clausewitz in the East as well in the West, and the Sun Tzu in the East, because cyber warfare is primarily a warfare which compels the enemy to do your will by inducing what is called as a strategic paralytic effect onto the victim nation, ultimately compelling him to reach the desired ends, and almost without any application of the physical fold. The best probable matching of the two theories. And in order to do that, the primary theory that I'm going to profess on is primarily the use of Trinitarian warfare in the current context, that too emerged in the cyberspace. Now, Clausewitz believed that this elusive trinity of the government, the people, and the military play an important role in any nation. Now, people, when I talk of including the economy, till the time all the three tendencies are there and they are interacting, any nation can go through any attack or anything, and it will revive back. It has a resilience, because the other two conditions, or other two the tendencies, would definitely pull out if in case, even if the attack has happened on one of the states. And that's what is actually the key of this whole aspect. If in the current sphere you look at a military extensively informationized, you have informationization in the form of C4ISR networks, command control networks, strategic networks, so far. Extensive informationization, this is a strategic enabler, but at the same time has resulted into what is called as a strategic vulnerability for the military. In case of people, the scenario is far more worse. You have critical information infrastructure, your gas, utilities, most of air traffic control networks, and so on, extensively depending upon information systems, SCADA systems, DCS, and so forth. The worst of all is banking. What exactly is money? Money is nothing. It's just numbers. Let's be frank about it. Even if you have thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in your vault, it is of no good use if the overall numbers that actually identify what is the cost of each currency, what would be the exchange rate, what is the kind of information in between them, that makes the paper or the currency actually valuable. So if that information is lost, and especially in a scenario of a global outreach where information, especially in the money domain, has been moving around, just imagine everything is dependent upon information systems. The scenario in the people is far more different, because in the current day scenarios, if you look at the psychological aspects, and one of my favorite authors is Bill Derudi, perceptions overweight reality. The society has changed. It's a risk society, and suddenly, all these important facilities on which a person is extensively dependent upon, suddenly they vanish. And especially this is much more contextual in case of Western societies. In India also, in most of the metros, things are like that. The way in which we are dependent upon the information systems, suddenly if all these things are systematically gone, the scenario on a common individual is going to be havoc. The scenario in case of government is almost the same, because governments typically exercise their control by gaining effective law enforcement and providing secure secular environment. But there again, extensive level of informationization is there. An important aspect is that what connects you from your government. It's essentially the media. If you want to know what your government is doing, you don't go to Prime Minister's office and say, come on, tell me what's there. It's the media that tells you, today this is what your government wants. So essentially media has become a sensory perception between you and the government. And just imagine these media networks, if they are taken over and extensive level of psyops are being conducted out, and subsequently what would be the effect on these tendencies. Hence, if you need, essentially whole of the country of any country is nothing more than a system of systems, brilliantly created systems which are integrated and created in a larger way, so that whole of the nation is nothing more than a system of systems. So essentially, if you want to achieve a strategic effect, you need to destroy all the three tendencies together. At the same time, identify critical components within the whole architecture of the system of systems, which would initiate what is called as a cascade effect. And the cascade effect is what? When one set of systems fail, the other set of systems automatically fail, and then you have the overall breakage of the whole system. All of this operation needs to be followed with the extensive level of what is called as psychological operations on the hijacked media networks, and that provide the appropriate level to introduce what is called as a parallel warfare in cyberspace. Now, parallel warfare was a term that was used by General Deputiller in Operation Desert Storm, but if you organize the whole of the attack on the three tendencies in a typical fashion, it would result into what is called as a rapid dominance in cyberspace, and that's what changes the whole game. The moment whole of this architecture is initiated out to identify these critical components, there is a theory called as critical component theory. It's not something new. In World War II, during the strategic bombing of Germany, critical component theory was used, and that was initiated in resulting into what is called an exact attack pattern in order to have a strategic effect. In order to orchestrate such a theory, you need to have an exact campaign plan, and like a typical military plan, this campaign plan also would consist of 5 important states. The first set of states are what are called as the pre-conflict states, the conflict states, and the post-conflict states. Now, the first state, or the shape state, state that basically is shaping your enemy, finding out what exactly your enemy is doing. And this is basically to find out its adversaries, vulnerabilities, his systems, what exactly his capability is, mapping out the things that can be utilized for later on, and so on. At the same time, boosting your national defense capabilities or deterrence capabilities, and then finding out the critical components that can initiate the cascade effect. And in fact, this cascade effect is the key part, because the moment this cascade effect initiates, the proportion of the results that you usually get are far more greater than the arithmetic numerical, what typically you will find in a serial kind of an engagement. Again, the second important aspect in this is to even introduce vulnerabilities within the enemy infrastructure. That can be in the form of bugged hardware, inducing in the form of front doors and so on, identifying critical information infrastructure in the enemy systems, introducing bugs and vulnerabilities within the exported operating systems, within the exported hardware to the enemy, finding out covert mechanisms. And one of the important aspects here is to understand that critical links in any information infrastructure, there are 2 important critical links. First is what is called as the undersea cables. Now, undersea cables are a strategic link. The second important aspect is satellite networks, because these are the primary 2 means to connect information systems into any country. So you need to have capability to have weapons in order to take care of both these capabilities, because they're going to play an actual role in a conflict scenario. The third important aspect here is to create a credible deterrence. And in order to create a credible deterrence, one of the primary theory that I proposed is what is called as a cyber triad. Very much similar to a nuclear triad, a cyber triad capability needs to be created. This triad should have three components. The first one should be the civilian and the military infrastructure and the offensive forces. Then the second triad would be a conglomerate of isolated air-gapped networks situated across friendly nations and across variant territories. The third and essential component of it is what is called as cyber militia or what we call as based on patriotic hackers, white hats, and so on, primarily to be initiated in case of an early warning of a potential strike. Important aspect of it is this credible deterrence should be known to your enemy. Now, this is not something new that I'm harping on, because NATO used to have this during the Cold War. This was called as the nuclear countervailing strategy. Now, the similar cyber countervailing strategy is required, where you should make your enemy believe, you should make your enemy give hints to your enemy that this is the kind of capability I have. And if you touch me, this is what you're gonna face. So essentially what this can be achieved by media coverages, extensive war games, and to some extent, I believe that covert instantiations of attacks, which are semi-attributable, in a way actually gives away the fact that you have the capability and conveys your deterrence capabilities to the enemy. It's my firm belief that we are already in a pre-conflict state, and right now most of the attacks that have happened, including the Estonia and the Georgia, the attacks that have happened around the world attributed to certain countries, it's apart from peacetime reconnaissance, these are a cyber countervailing signal. A country is actually signaling another country that yes, I have this capability, and if something goes wrong, I have a capability to pounce back. And that's the important point of making the cyber deterrence credible and known to the enemy. Now we move to the conflict phases. The conflict phases are typically two components of it. Either your deterrence has failed, or and you have initiated the conflict, or you have initiated the conflict, or an enemy has initiated the conflict. If you have initiated the conflict, your primary aim is to take down the enemy's cyber triad capabilities. Their first strike options, you need to understand what are the critical components you need to attack, and then ultimately resulting into what is called as freedom of operations in cyberspace. But if in case you are being attacked, you should always be with the assumption that there would be a loss of the triad. So that would be the basic assumption you should always start with, and that is the point you initiate your third triad component, that is your patriotic hackers, or what you call as cyber militia, because this would give you appropriate time during which your offensive capabilities can be brought together for an offensive attack onto the enemy nation. And that's an important part, because during an attack, your second strike capabilities are what actually makes you a more prudent effort. Now, it is important to realize that all these phases are to be executed in a parallel warfare manner, because there is nothing like a fixed phase, one phase starts and the other one goes off, because all these are overlapping phases and need to be orchestrated in a nice manner. And that's where the actuator of such a phases, or the planners of such a phases, play an important role. The important aspect is the last, or the post-conflict phase. You need to have an exit strategy. The effect that I am talking of, where a cascade effect has initiated, this would result into a total failure of the enemy infrastructure, IT infrastructure, and so on. The effect would be, serious disruptions, in their air traffic control networks, in their power grids, in their nuclear setups, in their dams, and so on. And subsequently, you can have your kinetic forces to go there as a humanitarian mission or so on, and take control of the land. I'm just changing the way in which typically cyber is used as a force enabler, but I'm trying to profess that how can kinetic means can be used as a force enabler in a strategic cyber campaign. The important aspect is whenever you have an exit strategy, you need to make sure that appropriate levels of infrastructure is re-placed back, so that you should not face what is called as a cyber insurgency of the patriotic hackers and so on. And this would be the last section of my talk, and this would be on the cyber defense. There would be three components of typically of a cyber defense. The first one is what is called as a technical deterrence. It would be nothing more than a notion of defense in depth, multiple layers of this. But I'll guarantee you one thing, that no matter whosoever says his system is like foolproof, there is nothing like foolproof in cyber system. There is always going to be a better place. The best way to achieve it is to have what is called as public-private partnership, because most of your critical infrastructure, they are actually in control of private sector. You need to have a very strong bonding over here. And then you need to look at the legal frameworks. You have the domestic laws, for example, the IT Act and so on. But important aspect is that with the lack of international treaties and extradition issues, where exactly we are. The classical MLATs won't work in cyber domain because of the way in which things work and the speed in which things work. So essentially, if you look at the overall legal scenario, you need to do it based on the causal and consequence analysis. You can define it into two models. One is primarily the law enforcement model, and that's where your Budapest Convention comes into play. But nevertheless, it also has certain components. For example, the Article 32 para B, which relates to the sovereignty concerns and so on, although they have changed it a bit. But the other component that is more relevant to the militaries, that's the LOAC model, or a law of armed conflict model. Typically what my friend Michael Schmidt, the program director for Talin Manual, says Lex Lata. So he's typically applying the additional protocols and Geneva Conventions and so on, subsequently, or LOAC to be more appropriate, with some aspects of outer space laws and to some aspects of the sea, the sea laws and so on, into identification of, or the maritime laws into identification of their similarities in cyberspace. The other aspect is to create a new treaty, or what we call as the Lex Fernanda, and that's something that I personally propose that nevertheless Lex Lata do exist, but yes, there are certain gaps that need to be filled, and that's where a new treaty proposition would make an actual contribution. I typically find that outer space treaty, especially the liability conventions and so on, the state responsibility components of it, play an important role. Nevertheless, you need to integrate that with an actual IHL model and the law of armed conflict, and then subsequently use the same for an actual orchestration for a cyberspace treaty, primarily through a UN body and so on. The last and the final component is ultimately everything boils down to the deterrence. As Lena said, essentially, if you create this form of deterrence, there are, strategic, the kind of attacks that I am talking of is not, what she referred to, like the ones like Stuxnet and so on. These are the kind of weapons, you are talking of strategic weapons. There is something called as tactical attacks, and then there is something called as strategic weapons. What this kind of a cyber deterrence assures is primarily a mutually assured destruction in cyberspace, and this essentially inhibits most of the serial players from actually using cyberspace in terms of cyber weapons in an actual conflict, and that's the key changer in it. You can have deterrence by punishment, what is there, but nevertheless deterrence by denial can also be initiated in the form of preemptive attacks on adversaries, especially on the non-state actors, I can say, in case of dire sequences. Nevertheless, not on the state actors, because this can result into what is called as escalatory models of a cyber conflict, resulting into the cascading of a larger conflict. But the key aspect here is attribution, and that is where everything boils down to, and that is the weakest link in cyberspace. Proxies play a lot of role. So in conclusion, your only cyber defense strategy would be a combination of technical deterrence, legal deterrence, and then a pure cyber deterrence. And to achieve that, you essentially require leadership in technology, systems, military, and so on. Civilian as well, as because this is one domain where civilians are much more enabled, much more because of their so far informationization in a way. At the same time, you need to have friendship. You need to have friendship within the system. You need to have friendships with industry, with your neighbors, and so on. And at the same time, partnership with academic institutions, partnership with a lot of your neighbors, friendly countries. The key aspect here is trust and responsibility. Responsibility both at individual level, organizational level, corporate level, governmental level, and global level. Till the time we do not have trust and responsibility in cyberspace, nothing's gonna actually be achieved. I know this is an important aspect where this differentiates from a classical attack. If you call about like Estonia, did Estonia actually make a strategic effect? Yes. Nevertheless, it changed a lot of things. But where exactly was the strategic effect? Because they were only targeting one of the tendencies, one or two of the tendencies, but subsequently the other component of the tendencies, they brought it back. They were resilient enough that they came back. The key important aspect is whenever these kind of an attacks need to be initiated, on What I am referring to is a total war, a typical strategic warfare concept where you are talking of a complete war. That is where the strategic essence of cyberspace is yet to deliver. What we are living right now is in a pre-conflict state, and it's pretty much shooting up. If you see, right from Stuxnet to tactical attacks, countervailing, and so on, everything pieces up very well. But a new part is yet to begin, and that's where the conflict would start. It's very much like a nuclear age, and it's maturing very fast. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry I was very fast, and sorry, sir, I jumped off the time. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.